Breaking news: Washington is officially moving forward with investigations into fresh mushroom imports from Canada, and the implications go way beyond produce aisles and pizza toppings. Why? Because when the US government starts using words like materially injured and less than fair value, it's not just a trade dispute. It's the opening act of potential tariffs, retaliation, and another supply chain shock Americans didn't ask for. So here's the question: are we watching legitimate enforcement of trade rules, or the next policy overreaction that drives prices up and trust down? Tonight, I'm breaking down three things. One, what the U.S. International Trade Commission just decided and why it matters. Two, how the anti-dumping and subsidy process actually works and what happens next. Three, who pays the price if this escalates? Workers, small businesses, and consumers. And it gets worse, because this case is happening at the exact moment the US economy is still sensitive to food price volatility. Here's what just happened in plain terms. The US International Trade Commission, the USITC, has voted that there is a reasonable indication that a US industry is being materially injured by fresh mushrooms imported from Canada, which are allegedly dumped, meaning sold at less than fair value, and allegedly subsidized by the Canadian government. That determination was issued January 15th, 2026, and it keeps the case alive. Three commissioners, Chair Amy A. Carpel, David S. Johansen, and Jason E. Kearns, voted yes, and that yes matters because it triggers the next stage. The U.S. Department of Commerce continues its investigations. Now zoom in on the political mechanics here. Commerce has already initiated anti-dumping, AD, and countervailing duty, CVD, investigations, announced January 6th, 2026. The alleged dumping and subsidy claims come from petitioners organized under the Fresh Mushrooms Fair Trade Coalition, including growers tied to locations like Blandon, Pennsylvania, Avondale, Pennsylvania, West Grove, Pennsylvania, Lincoln University, Pennsylvania, and Miami, Oklahoma. And here's the human side. Picture a family-owned diner near the Pennsylvania mushroom belt, the kind of place that runs on tight margins. Mushrooms go into omelets, burgers, gravies, and soups. If prices spike due to duties or supply shifts, menus change, costs rise, and regular customers feel it immediately. Have you noticed how small price changes add up fast at checkout? But here's the kicker. Mushrooms Canada says it's disappointed, but confident the final outcome will show compliance with rules-based trade. Their CEO, Ryan Kuslag, says the allegations are unfounded and argues Canadian mushrooms support, not harm, the North American market. So who's right and what happens next? To understand why this matters, you have to understand what this process actually is. This isn't a random political tantrum. The U.S. trade enforcement system runs on a two-track structure. One, Commerce decides whether dumping subsidization is happening and calculates potential rates. Two, the USITC decides whether the domestic industry is actually being injured. Right now, the USITC has issued a preliminary injury determination, not a final verdict, saying there's a reasonable indication of harm. That's an early threshold, and it keeps the train moving. So what's next? Commerce's timeline is laid out clearly. If the case continues, Commerce is scheduled to issue a CVD preliminary determination on February 18th, 2026, and an AD preliminary determination on May 4th, 2026, with possible extensions under the statute. And then there's the USITC's own documentation. The Commission's public report, USITC Publication 5695, titled Fresh Mushrooms from Canada, is expected to be available by February 19th, 2026. That report will contain the Commission's views and the information developed during investigations. Now let's talk about the alleged conduct in simple terms. Dumping typically means a foreign producer sells goods into the U.S. market at a price lower than what's considered fair, often compared to home market prices or constructed costs. Countervailing duties address subsidies, government support that allegedly gives exporters an unfair advantage. But what does material injury mean? It's not a vague vibe. It's supposed to reflect measurable harm, lost sales, declining profits, reduced capacity utilization, downward price pressure, things analysts track. Here's the analogy. Think of the mushroom market like a neighborhood where two bakeries compete. If one bakery starts selling bread for less than the cost of flour because someone else is covering part of the bill, customers flock there. The other bakery doesn't just lose customers, it gets forced to cut workers, reduce quality, or close. That's the core claim US petitioners are making here, whether proven or not. But here's what should alarm you. Trade cases like this rarely stay surgical. Once tariffs are on the table, the incentives change. Everyone starts positioning. Producers lobby, importers hedge, retailers renegotiate contracts, and politicians claim they're protecting jobs. And it gets worse when uncertainty becomes the real tax. Even before duties are imposed, companies may pull back from purchasing, shift supply, or stockpile, causing price distortions. This case also has a bureaucratic fingerprint. Commerce notes that additional case information, including scope and alleged subsidy programs, sits in the access system under case numbers A122-873 and C122-874. That's the formal pipeline for how evidence and claims move. Now, history matters here. The US has long used AD/CVD actions as a pressure tool, sometimes as legitimate enforcement, sometimes as a political valve. Analysts warn that even a narrow case can become a precedent. Once one agricultural product is targeted, others may follow as domestic industries search for relief through enforcement rather than innovation. So ask yourself, is the US responding to genuine data-backed harm, or are we building another cycle where the solution becomes higher consumer prices and a new cross-border feud? Because remember, mushrooms are not luxury goods. They're an everyday ingredient across American kitchens, restaurants, and food manufacturing. Small disruptions ripple fast. And here's the kicker. Mushrooms Canada argues the industry's success is built through strong collaboration and that the Canadian and US economies are deeply interconnected, meaning enforcement actions don't happen in a vacuum. So the policy decision isn't just protect growers, it's choosing which part of the supply chain absorbs risk. Let's break down who gets hit if this investigation escalates into duties or long-term supply disruption. American workers and families. First, US agricultural workers. The petitioners include multiple US growers and packers, many in Pennsylvania, who argue they're being harmed and want relief. If they're right, duties could stabilize pricing and protect jobs in growing regions. But if they're wrong, or if the remedy overshoots, the consumer side pays. Second, families on tight budgets. Mushrooms are a staple in low-cost meals. Pasta sauces, casseroles, breakfast skillets. A small price move across millions of shopping carts becomes a real cost of living pressure. Have you noticed how one more increase always shows up right when households are already stretched? Third, restaurant workers. When input costs rise, menu prices rise, or portions shrink, or hours get cut. That's not theory. That's how margins work in food service. But here's the kicker. Uncertainty alone can cause disruption even without tariffs. If importers fear retroactive duty risk, they may reduce shipments early, tightening supply before any official penalty is imposed. Small businesses, case study, imagine a mid-sized pizza chain operating across the Midwest. They buy mushrooms through a distributor who sources both domestic and imported product to stabilize supply year-round. Suddenly, the distributor warns, Canadian supply might face duties, contracts may change. The chain now has to choose between higher ingredient costs or changing recipes, risking customer satisfaction. Is that protecting the American economy? Or shifting pain from one group to another? Large corporations, big grocery retailers, and food distributors are extremely sensitive to price stability. If duties are imposed, they reprice quickly and push suppliers for concessions. That can squeeze producers on both sides of the border. Analysts often warn that when trade enforcement triggers repricing, the largest players adapt fastest, while smaller players get crushed in the middle. And remember, this isn't happening in a vacuum. Commerce itself notes it maintains 797 AD and CVD orders across industries. That signals a broader enforcement posture, and markets watch that posture. International partners. Canada is not a distant trade partner, it's a tightly integrated one. Actions like this can generate political friction quickly, even when the product seems small. Mushrooms Canada is already publicly pushing back, framing Canadian production as high quality and responsibly produced, and emphasizing cross-border interdependence. Experts and analysts generally warn about two ripple effects here. One, retaliation risk, not necessarily on mushrooms, but on other sensitive sectors. Two, precedent risk, more petitions, more investigations, and more administrative trade conflict. So ask yourself, if the goal is stability, why are we playing with policy tools that inject uncertainty into food supply chains? Because by minute 9 of this story, the tension peaks. If duties are recommended, the economic logic quickly becomes political logic, and political logic rarely prioritizes consumer prices. Now let's anchor this with what officials and industry leaders are actually saying. The USITC states there is a reasonable indication the U.S. industry is materially injured by imports allegedly sold at less than fair value and subsidized by the Canadian government. That is the Commission putting a formal stamp on the complaint, enough to proceed, not enough to convict. Meanwhile, Mushrooms Canada CEO Ryan Kozlag says, "We intend to demonstrate clearly that the allegations against our sector are unfounded," arguing Canadian growers support, not harm, the North American market. That's a direct rejection of the injury narrative, and Commerce's framing is explicit. It has initiated AD/CVD investigations and lays out scheduled dates for preliminary determinations, February 18, 2026, CVD, and May 4, 2026, AD, meaning the next 30 to 90 days are when the pressure spikes. So what are the consequences? Legal implications. If Commerce finds dumping or subsidies and the USITC later finds final injury, duties can be imposed. That changes import economics immediately. Economic implications. Duty risk can reshape purchasing now, not later. Companies may shift suppliers, renegotiate contracts, and build inventory buffers. Political implications. This becomes a talking point about protecting domestic agriculture versus keeping food affordable. And once politicians smell that narrative, the chances of calm, technical decision-making drop fast. Short term, next 30, 90 days, expect lobbying to intensify, media messaging to escalate, and buyer behavior to shift as companies prepare for the possibility of preliminary duties. Medium term, 6-12 months. One scenario is a duty regime that locks in higher prices and encourages more petitions in other agricultural categories. Another scenario is the investigations collapse under scrutiny and the relationship stabilizes, but not before the uncertainty tax has already been paid. So here's the question. Do we want trade enforcement that targets real cheating, or a system that becomes a permanent lever for price shocks and political theater? Let's recap the 3 critical points. First, the USITC votes to move ahead, saying there's a reasonable indication of material injury tied to alleged dumping and subsidies. This case is alive and accelerating. Second, Commerce is already in motion, with key dates coming fast, February 18th, 2026, and May 4th, 2026, meaning the next few months are the danger zone for price volatility and supply disruption. Third, the fallout could land on everyone, workers, small businesses, and families, while Canada publicly pushes back, warning the allegations are unfounded. The takeaway is simple. When trade policy becomes a blunt instrument, ordinary people often pay first. So tell me in the comments, is this enforcement or escalation? If you want to stay informed on stories the mainstream media won't fully cover, make sure you're subscribed and hit the bell icon. One last thought. The smallest products can expose the biggest policy failures. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.